Hello and welcome to Dialogue. According to the latest official figures, China's GDP reached 59.3 trillion yuan, or about $8.3 trillion in the first half of 2023, expanding 5.5% year on year. How solid is the country's economic growth so far? How worried is the market over unemployment, deflation, and weakening demand at home and abroad? And what are the solutions to support a stronger economic recovery? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by John Gung, professor from the University of International Business and Economics, Chu Qiang, research fellow from Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. John, I will start with you. So the 5.5% of economic growth in the first half of this year, what's your take of this number?
Well, my overall impression is that's not too bad, but I think it's more meaningful is the figure in the second quarter, which is 6.3%. I think it's a little bit short of the market expectations. I think in general people are expecting 7%. This number is actually not low at all, but compared to the second quarter last year, the consensus that the economy should be in much better shape. Because the second quarter of last year was horrible. It was barely any growth, and in the midst of the pandemic, if we still remember that. But currently, the number is coming at 6.3%. There are some weaknesses, as I can see it. For example, in the private sector, the growth is less than 2%. In the sector of foreign companies, it's even less than 1%. These are weaknesses that are dragging down the overall performance. I think what worries me more is on the investment side, particularly on the private sector. I think the government needs to do something here. I think it's a imperative time to come up with a solid package to jumpstart the economy. Even though 6.3% the second quarter is actually fairly high compared to many other economies, particularly in the developed world, but still we were expecting something more. Our overall annual target for this year is about 5%. With this performance, I think the second half of the year really needs to pick up, needs to step up. I'm looking forward to some solid policies from the central government.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, you have two stories. If you look at the overall performance of the first 6 months, 5.5% is fine. Given this yearly goal is about 5%, so that's more or less reaching the goal. But if you look at the second quarter, expectation was 7, but it's 6.3. That's a bit disappointing for a lot of people. And so what's your opinion over there?
Well, Qingduo, I think that there's a lot of volatility around expectations for China's economic growth. And I think it's important to point out here that a year ago, people were enormously pessimistic and thought that a 5% target was far, far too optimistic. And it's important to recognize, too, that the way China, the government, thinks about economic growth is different from some Western countries in that there's a target which gives every level of government a goal to work towards. So in a way, it's like an earnings target for a publicly listed company. So when I look at this, 6.3 Q2, 4.8 Q1, we're well within the band of hitting about 5%. So if Q3, Q4 come in roughly about these numbers, we're there. So there'd be much greater cause for concern if the numbers were either far, far higher. I would say even if it came in at 7%, I would be worried. If it came much lower than 4-ish, I would be worried. And it's within this range, I think is actually not a bad thing. The concern I have, though, which is somewhat related to what John just said, is not just the gross number, but we also need to pay attention to how broad-based and balanced the growth is. And this is certainly an area I think we'll talk more about. But this is where I think the attention should be paid, not so much the headline numbers.
Okay, now here is the key question, Chu Qiang. There are questions, being raised. Whether the China's economic growth, for example, for the second quarter, is losing momentum because it's not reaching 7% expectation.
Well, I think actually is within our expectation. I have several reasons for that. First of all, as I always mentioned, as we've been discussed in the earlier, dialogue of this year, I'll be saying this is going to be a steady but slow growth, a recovery, for sure. Because number one thing is the base number effect. What's that? It's because we're comparing our CPI toward the high CPI situation last year. It's year-on-year comparison. Last year, if you remember, we have the outbreak of the geopolitical conflict, soaring up, skyrocketing raw material prices, energy prices, and the central bank all over the world, especially in the Western countries, are downpouring the liquidities into the market to just try to save the market. Therefore, we'll be seeing the huge base numbers last year at the same period of time. And you're comparing this year's same period of time to last year, but you're going to see many numbers are not growing so fast. The PMI, CPI, that's actually within our expectation. That's science. That's basic mathematics. And secondly, if you take a look at the general growth pattern of many countries, well, when the great economy developed to a certain phase, for example, America, for example, Japan, for example, Germany, South Korea, when they experience the high-speed growth, when they just come across certain threshold, their growth rate is going to slow down for sure, because that's also the basic, economics. They're going to be what's like America, 3% of the growth, 4% of the growth. For China, recent period of time, I think 4.5%, 5.5% or 6% a year can be the normal rate because its absolute growth number is very, very large. If China only quote unquote grow at 5.5% a year, as we're doing right now, disappointing right now, every year what China created equals to Indonesia plus India plus Vietnam plus Malaysia together can create. And at this speed, China, more than 10 years, can be a larger economy more than USA. So I don't know why people are getting disappointed about this. And also, another thing we're looking at is China is recovering just with half of a years of, repairment, with restoration. So, this trajectory is solid. You cannot say, okay, this blood pressure is 70 and 100, it's a bit low. No, we're comparing to before, not comparing to the heydays. And China will get to the heydays again, I'm sure about that. So just take a look at the trajectory. I think that's pointing at the right direction.
Yeah, right direction. Okay, you also touched upon the CPI. We will, talk about that a bit later on. Whether this economy somehow is suffering from deflation. But anyway, let's go back to John. You mentioned about the private sector and foreign companies in China. Their performance is dragging down, the economic growth here. So what are the reasons and what are the effects? For example, is that the major cause for this high unemployment rate for the young people aged from 16 to 24? 21.3% of a jobless rate in China now.
Well, let me first make a comment on a previous statement. I think China is growth figures is a league of its own. It's mostly developing countries. Economic theory says that these developing countries tend to grow a little bit faster than the developed countries. We used to be accustomed to China's growth number in the higher single-digit number region. We're gradually seeing this thing coming down and down. But I think overall, we economists still tend to believe that China's growth figure should be in the at least 5% range. Maybe 6-7% is behind us for good, but I think compared to the United States and Western economies, European Union, Japan, for example. These countries, they have a growth figure in 1-2%. 3% is called a growth number. 3% for China certainly is disastrous. But so I think we need to raise our expectation a little bit more. We need to be in the 5% range at least for the next few years. So that's what we're all striving for. Now back to your question about what's dragging behind. What's the reason that the private sector is still now fully recovering. I think this has everything to do with investment confidence. I think there's some signs of recovery in this month in June. We're starting to see, for example, the loan balance amount is starting to pick up. That's a very good sign. So I think as long as the private sector is making investments, things will turn around for sure. Now, when you ask a question about unemployment, we know that the private sector is the workhorse of creating jobs. There's this 20-80 rule here. 80% of the companies, they account for, the private sector accounts for probably 20% of China's GDP, but they create 80% of the jobs. So, the private sector coming back is really the engine for creating jobs. And I think particularly the young, the jobs for these young workers and the people just entering the job market. These are starting jobs. These are the lower entry jobs. These probably the people pay least, and they are usually the victims of a slowdown economy. And we've been seeing that the unemployment rate for this market segment, the job market, has been steadily coming back. Now it's over 20%, which is very bothersome. So I think what's really driving this is that the private sector needs to pick up. Now the foreign companies, I think this has a lot to do with the China-U.S. competition. More and more companies, apparently foreign companies, multinational companies, are adopting this China Plus One strategy. They're moving some of their capacities out of China. That's certainly happening, and I think that's going to have an impact on our job market. So I think these are two sectors that are very bothersome to me. And I hope that there must be some policies to jumpstart this part of the economy.
Well, Andy, you also mentioned about this uneven growth. You see that as the problem. You do see the consumption the number is very positive, like 8.3%. That's very upbeating. But then, of course, the other numbers are not that encouraging. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, Tingduo, as we know, any country, any economy needs a certain level of equality. And a lot of that equality comes from balanced economic growth. And I think China recognizes this very well. One thing I want to say about the issue of youth unemployment with regard to this, because one way we can think about equality is, how is unemployment affecting different sectors of the population, is that there are cyclical factors, but I think there are also structural factors as well, in that hiring people straight out of college can be an expensive proposition for many businesses because there's a certain amount of training, a certain amount of time it takes for them to be productive. And as China's economy becomes increasingly competitive globally, I think that bar is rising. So in difficult economic circumstances, companies think twice before bringing on somebody that might take a few months, half a year, maybe even a year to be very productive. So I think this is an issue that ought to be considered. The other thing I want to point out, too, is that China has recognized the mistakes that the U.S. made in letting capital be paramount, or I guess sometimes the Chinese say the disorderly expansion of capital, which led to the financial crisis, a lot of other ills. And China's looking to balance this, where the government is making sure that everyone is looked after. At the same time, the market forces are still an engine for growth, but are not destroying society at the same time. And this is a very difficult balance to strike, but I think that China's making progress in this area, in this respect.
Well, Chu-Chiang, obviously, if you look at the number in particular, like the numbers for last month in June, foreign trade is, has fallen, probably the largest. Some of the figures are not really good. But at the same time, you notice this is almost like a pattern. This is not only for China, but also for South Korea, for India, for Vietnam. What's the problem? Why we are seeing, like less and less trade, less export and less import?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this. Is actually another very important factor we really need to mention to everyone. That is a strong dollar and the policy of the monetary in the USA. a lot of people just pay attention to domestic situation. Okay, our market is looming, and what's the problem of the structure in our economy? No, actually not. It's globalized economy right now. U.S. dollar played a very, very important role in the global trade and the global finance. Just take a look at the open number of Chinese central bank. We have 35 trillion yuan worth of the balance sheet in Central Bank of China, and among which there are 3 trillion U.S. dollar worth of foreign reserve. So just take a look. When U.S. Federal Reserve try to spike up its interest rate or lower their interest rate, how much impact it will give to China? And considering China is still one of the largest and safest buffer of the foreign reserve, so China is probably largely immune to this kind of change in the U.S. Monetary policy change. About the small countries with very, very little, foreign reserve buffers, what U.S. A hike up of the interest rate can influence on their domestic demand, export and import, and monetary policy. Because the strong dollar is there, so a lot of countries have to, depreciate their currency. So the import and export is become a disaster. Their monetary policy become in vain. Their central bank hands are all tied. They have nothing to do. Means their financial market are losing function. So that's the reason why we're seeing the whole vitality of the global market, no matter in the real economy or financial economy, has been drained out. We probably will feel a little bit eased up because the Federal Reserve recently probably is going to stop their interest rate hike. They give us some space to take some breaths. But right now, the strong dollar effect is still in its heyday. It's still in the peak. So we still need to tough through the toughest moment and wait to see the second half of the year when Federal Reserve really loosen up their policy. And then by that time, I think not only China, the whole globe and the whole demand, not only in the real economy, but also in the financial market, will actually, enjoy some good moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there will be some good moment. Joan, as Chi-Chiang talked about trade, and you mentioned about the foreign companies, it all has to do with what's going on geopolitically, like de-risking or decoupling between the U.S. and China. European countries are also doing something similar. You mentioned about in the foreign business, they are doing like a China +1, as their long-term strategy to basically deal with, possible political effects of their trade is falling. Is there anything you can do? China is part of the global economy. It is closely connected with the rest of the world. So do you see any, ups and downs? We are seeing downs, but is there anything positive and anything encouraging?
Well, the May and June exports numbers are, a little bit weak, as you just pointed out. But I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about our export sector. China's export sector never failed to, give pleasant surprises to people. I think the May and June numbers compared to many major exporting countries, it's actually not bad at all. I mean, if you look at the major exporters like Germany, South Korea, even Vietnam, I mean, they're actually experiencing even larger drops. So I think, comparatively speaking, I think China's export sector are holding quite well. And also, if you look at the products within the exports portfolio that represent the future, it's even actually more encouraging. Look at the batteries, electric cars, photovoltaic products, and it's actually doing very well. I think what's happening here is that as you pointed out, as also I pointed out, some Western countries are adopting de-risking or whatever you call it, decoupling. There's clearly a little bit of a diversion away from the supply chain source from China. There's no doubt about it. But I think overall in the entire world, there's also a structural reorientation of the international trade going on right now, particularly involving Russia. If you look at China's exports to Russia, it's indeed shooting through the roof, right? I mean, it's like 90% growth. So that's a bright spot. So in that sense, I think China's exports structure is also undergoing a very large change. We're not solely relying upon these Western economies anymore. Trade with developing countries, ASEAN market, the countries engaged in Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly with Russia, they're actually doing very well. So I would expect this pattern to continue. And I would still expect that China's overall exports will continue to remain very competitive China's exports as a percentage of total global trade will maintain at the same level, if not still going up. And in the grand scheme of things, China is still the world's largest trading nation. There's no doubt about it. I think this position will continue to be kept in the next at least 2 or 3, 4 years.
Well, Andy, obviously for any country right now, their economic performance will be affected or will be closely related to the performance of the rest of the world. Not globally, what do you see as the economic performance in the near future? For example, European economies, German ones, the U.S., North American economies, the Asian economies, Southeast Asia, China. So what's the prospect for the near future?
Well, I think one thing, Tingduo, is we are still feeling the hangover from COVID, in that during COVID, especially in the United States, many people were stuck at home, so they were buying lots of stuff from China. And that pulled a lot of demand forward. So if you bought new furniture, you've bought new electronics, you're probably going to be using them for the next couple of years. So I think that's going to be a little bit of a hangover for the global economy. I think the second big factor is, of course, what happens with the U.S. Federal Reserve, because these high interest rates are imposing enormous collateral damage all around the world, especially with developing markets, as we've heard. And this is a very important factor. So I think we have to keep an eye on this for the future global outlook. But I completely agree with John in that the structure of Chinese exports are changing, and probably for the better. But the real important point here, I think, is China is developing a much larger, much more sophisticated, much more unified domestic market. So historically, it was the external wheel that turned the domestic economy. And now we see with this dual circulation that it's really going to be the domestic market that drives the external wheel. And as that unfolds over the next few years, I think that's an enormous positive for China, and would be an enormous positive for the world, at least for those countries that are, I think, open and smart enough to recognize the opportunity.
Well, earlier, Chu-Chiang, you mentioned about a possible deflation. That worries a lot of people. If you look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, in June, I think it stood unchanged from a year earlier, but it's down from 0.2% growth in May. What's the definition of deflation? Are we in deflation? I mean, how bad is a deflation to an economy?
Well, we don't have a official kind of a standard in China, but according to the MBR in America, and their deflation definition is at least they're going to have the down growth of the CPI for at least a consecutive 3 to 6 months. And China basically does not meet that kind of standard. And considering China right now is in a very, very special kind of a background of the history, long COVID, as Andy just mentioned, and also still going on geopolitical conflicts globally, and also very, very historically high-strung U.S. dollars. So right now it's very hard to make sure that China is in deflation or not. But basically, for my opinion, I don't think there is a pressure for deflation. Because number one, as we mentioned, it's a very special background. And secondly, we've been seeing in many, many sectors, the price index is going up very quickly or recovering very steadily. I think the main reason that dragging down the situation is one of the real estate market. And also, secondly, it's about strong U.S. dollar and Federal Reserve monetary policy. And the third, well, it's very Chinese characteristic, it's the pork price. Pork price made a very, very large share in our CPI basket. And last year, because of the economic, reason, because of the seasonal reason, the Chinese pork price is still keeping down in a very low bottom. So that's the reason why we've been seeing the CPI number is keeping low. But with our experience, when this, what we call the circle of the pork price has turned over, I think the CPI is going to climb up as usual. So I don't think the price, the deflation pressure is in us, but more we should take a look at the growth side, especially how much people can make and how much people are spending. This is more important.
Well, spending is important, John, but this weak domestic demand, the government has tried to encourage more consumption by the public, but it's not that successful, right?
Well, I think it's a much more nuanced picture here. I think we have to look at different stratas of the consumer markets. I think people who have money in the bank, they're actually spending money quite heavily. You look at the travel industry. Typically, this is something that the people relatively well off do normally. I mean, the travel industry is doing very well. The hotels are booked. The trains and flights are very busy. I think what's happening that's falling short of consumption expectation is really the consumption from the lower end of the market. People who were previously unemployed, people who don't have much savings in the bank, people who are trying to look for jobs, and I think these people are really haven't really recovered yet. And I think this is it's by no means it's a small market, by the way. There are a lot of people out there like this. So I think it's the lower end of the consumer market that are really not spending money right now, and they have to weigh. They have to weigh the fiscal policy, the investments to percolate down into the economy so that it can create jobs for them, it can create incomes for them before they can spend money. And I think that takes a little bit of time to happen. And I think the June number is showing some signs that things are moving in that direction, and hopefully more jobs are created in that regard, and these people will start spending money. And I think probably by that time the economy and consumption will come back a little bit more.
So Andy, are you expecting any policy changes? For example, fiscal policies or monetary policies, especially any stimulus, to encourage people to spend more?
Well, I think, Qingduo, in the short term, between now and the end of the year, I think we have to watch very closely what the next 2 quarters look like, because again, GDP growth in China is a target that is managed towards and used as a means to coordinate all of the levels of government. So certainly, if the numbers start coming in weak, I think we should expect greater monetary and fiscal support. Also, if there's other recognized imbalances, clearly there will be a short-term response. I think longer term, what made China successful economically was a focus on manufacturing exports, which made it the workshop of the world. But we are, I think, at an inflection point where if China wants to achieve a different kind of high-quality growth and prosperity, there will have to be more structural changes to encourage consumption. So not as much specific policies such as lower taxes, subsidies, but really some deeper changes. And I think we have to keep our eyes out for that and watch as this unfolds over the next few years.
So any policy change expectation, Qiqiang, very briefly?
No, I don't think there's going to be any major policy changes, but I think it's good news. Hands down for the government and hands on for the market. Let the market do its magic.
Okay, so let the market do its magic. John?
Oh, I hope things will come back. I'm actually quite confident that things will start to change. As I said, June number starting to show signs of recovery, and hopefully, the most important thing is that these policy change, these investments, we percolate down to people who really going to spend the money.
All right. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.